THW.
What did side governments set out to do from this debate from the offset, Mr. Speaker? We told you that there are wars being waged, that the US have engaged themselves in wars around the country, around the world, and this debate is not about whether those wars are justified, even if it's by the US's definition. There are wars being waged and there's conscription apathy. Do we want to lose the war? No. Do we want to win it? Every state wants to win it if they are in a specific war, Mr. Speaker. That's the problem that we've been trying to solve. The fact that opposition has agreed to that problem, but never, we didn't hear a clear example or a clear solution from their side, shows you that conscription is a problem and what they've been running on is a pure negative case. Because the speaker before me said a couple of very, very important things. He said there are other avenues, Mr. Speaker, like A, make the military more enticing. B, make it mandatory, Mr. Speaker. I'll give you another avenue. How about hire foreign mercenaries? All these things can solve apathy, Mr. Speaker. But does it ensure that the US will win the war? No. Why? Because the problem that Pudiso outlined from the offset was that psychological deterrence of your own people. Sit down, Mr. Speaker. When I see my fellow US citizen with his intestines hanging out of his own stomach, Mr. Speaker, I do not want to be conscripted into that very army because I'm psychologically fearful and I've been psychologically harmed, Mr. Speaker, from joining that army. That is the problem that's currently happening. The US is losing its own personnel. First question of this debate, Mr. Speaker, is the dire need of this proposal and why this needs to work now. We told you that conscription is lax within our very own people. Why? Firstly, we've seen the war ourselves. There's nobody else, Mr. Speaker, who has taken a better interest than the US citizens themselves to look at the pictures, to look at the graphics of these images, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, conscription apathy is a problem. But more importantly, if we force them or make things more enticing, that doesn't improve that motivation to fight the war better, Mr. Speaker. Now, compare that, Mr. Speaker, to the kind of payment we're giving foreign countries or foreign military, Mr. Speaker, and that payment is used as an incentive to fight the war. So motivation becomes a very, very big bone of contention in today's debate. The speaker before me talked about how there needs to be a form of genuine, interest in these wars. Exactly. When you put people there who are unwilling to fight the war, when you put people who are psychologically fearful, then you lose that kind of genuine motivation, as opposed to payments, the incentives that comes from payments, Mr. Speaker. What have they told us? They've told us, look, liability is a problem, accountability is a problem, there are harms, and we need a solution. But the problem is, we need a solution and we need it now. Barona extensively explained to you from the offset of her speech that this is a time-sensitive issue. We cannot afford to waste any more time because it's a war that's currently being waged, and we think that's very, very important. Hello.
Mr. Speaker, what exactly is the war you're talking about?
A bit too late, don't you think? We think that it's already fundamental that we know the kinds of wars that the US are currently engaged in. Don't try to hoodwink this issue. But let's go to the second idea, Mr. Speaker, which is a bulk of their substantives, the harms. Firstly, they say that the US will engage in proxy wars and use these foreign military and those kinds of things. Firstly, we tell you that that can happen under status quo, even if you use your own personnel. Those are the kinds of tactics that the general uses, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that these are the proxy wars will not happen necessarily specifically because you hire foreign military personnel. We told you that the intel remains with these generals. They are the ones that are fully accountable for these types of wars. So we think that proxy wars, is not mutually exclusive under your paradigm where you want to remain with status quo. If your generals feel that they want to wage proxy wars, they can do it with their own military as well, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, where they say that, if we hire these military from foreign countries, these foreign countries will be antagonized by the international community. And we find that problematic. Why? Because we're not forcing these militaries to buy in to this proposal, Mr. Speaker. It's done on an opt-in basis. If you want to, and you know the kind of risks that you assume with that willingness to buy this proposal, we think that's perfectly okay. But more importantly, we just think that that substantive is just not true. Why? Because in the past, Mr. Speaker, we've seen that the United Nations has sent peacekeepers all over the world, Mr. Speaker, when you've directly engaged in wars. For example, Congo. And even in Kenya, Mr. Speaker, when there was political divide a couple of years ago, Did that create any form of resentment or any form of antagonism between Kenya and the United Nations, even though Kenya didn't want those people there, Mr. Speaker? We don't think that's the case. We don't think that antagonism is a big enough issue, Mr. Speaker, specifically because if you have a country that has a large populace of military personnel and you make that decision, you assume the risks as well. If you're not happy, don't do it. Simple enough. We're not forcing you to do it, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
We think that's mutually exclusive. Sit down. The third question that I want to talk about in today's debate is the idea of accountability, because they keep pushing this burden onto us, right? They tell us that, look, they will not be accountable and we feel that's problematic, and so on and so forth. We told you, firstly, Mr. Speaker, intelligence will remain with the upper levels of authority of those who are paying, Mr. Speaker, i.e. the generals and your commanders of your US military. So we don't think that intelligence will leak out. If there are any mistakes and the probabilities of failure and all that, we've already told you in Podiso's speech, the accountability will be totally assumed by the US military, by these guys that hire them. No amount of responsibility or accountability will be pushed over to these foreign countries, and we think that's just fine. On that idea that they try to hoodwink to you that wars will suddenly become convenient, Mr. Speaker, that the US will suddenly go, let's wage a war on A, B, C, and D. We don't think that will happen for two reasons. Firstly, we need to answer to our own people the kinds of wars we wage. Sit down. Let me give you an example, Mr. Speaker. When 9/11 happened, the US people were for going to Afghanistan. They were for going to Iraq. Till they saw the kinds of things that happened, then they decided we made a mistake. That's when the government needs to be accountable to its own people, Mr. Speaker. But more than that, we feel that the US administration, and especially the Obama administration, also needs to answer to the international community. Are there checks and balances in place when any country wants to wage wars? Yes, there are, Mr. Speaker, because there are always checks and balances, there are always people to answer to. And I've given you two specific stakeholders, our own people, Mr. Speaker, and these foreign people. But again, this debate is not about what is best or whether this war is justified, Mr. Speaker. If at all there are mistakes, we assume the accountability, we assume the responsibility, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because we have to answer to our very own people, as well as the international community that actually poses questions to us. But let's just deal with this idea of what happens if we don't do this, Mr. Speaker, and what are the other avenues that exist. Buruna told you that we don't want to be like countries who hire foreign mercenaries and things like this, because that is harmful. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, these are wars that we're currently waging. These are wars that we want to win. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's justified or not, but if they are happening, we need to win them, and what are the best avenues? We told you that it's a win-win situation for both of these countries, Mr. Speaker. We don't find an inherent harm to the countries that are willing to give their military personnel, specifically because it's done on a willing basis, specifically because it's done on an opt-in basis. They're not forced. If they will understand the risks that they assume with this, they will understand the consequences that happen with this, lives are lost. If at all they choose to do so, allow them to. We don't find a harm. We're very proud to propose.
Right, thanks Speaker for your speech, and invite the opposition whip Speaker to take the floor.
Yeah.
First, I'm going to discuss the principle of lending army and how this tackles the side of the lender instead of the US, which they forgot in this debate. The second part of my speech would discuss, is this good for the US, the expansion of war throughout the whole world, and what are the social implications for it. Now, for government side, they give us really unfair characterization. They tell us right now, the US fights so many wars, which is true. But they tell us not to justify the fact or the principle of these wars. They're telling us, even if the war is good or bad, it's not this debate. Which I find unfair, because right now the US criticized for fighting so many wars. And we firmly believe that if you let this principle fly, it's going to be so easy for the US to fight more wars. Now they tell us that, look, this debate is about whether or not, or when you're in the context that the US has no more men because they have a shortage of soldiers and they're forcing to conscript their own men. Which we tell you it's quite impossible because they have so many people out there. And it's a fantasy setting. They tell us, we tell you that, being the second biggest economy and having so many friends, the US will never reach this. But anyway, I'm going to discuss and rebut the ideas they presented to us. The first issue discuss is this. First proposition tells us, the state has to protect their own citizens, so they have to maximize every single resource to make sure that the citizens are protected. And they extended this to the fact that armies are there to protect their own people. Now, the response here is how you're not achieving the goals for the lender in itself. Because we tell you, when you're entering war, no matter what kind of war, you're putting your homeland at risk. Meaning, if I send in a military force, my house will be a target right now because that's a source of these people. And we tell you, under the lender's part, when you enter war, you make your home country a big risk. And what happens is, what you're doing is that you're making yourself a target, and so you increase a risk there, and you put your citizens in harm. So we tell you, under that principle, lending your army is not justified. The second idea, which is quite funny, is because they're telling us, we're going to get people of foreign nationalities to serve under U.S. generals. In short, for the lender, what happens is I'm going to give out my soldiers who will serve under U.S. generals, who, number one, don't have responsibility towards them because they're not their own brothers in the same country, meaning it's easier for them to die. We tell you, if that's the case, then you're making the lives of these soldiers who are lent now under more danger, and doesn't fulfill the responsibility of war, contrary to what they're doing. So we're telling you, under their side, you're not fulfilling your goals of protecting your citizens. In fact, you're harming them for the benefit of the United States, which is kind of unfair. The next idea is quite unrealistic because we tell you no country would want to go into battle for money itself. Please sit down, no thank you. Because they clearly tell us that there's so many harms if you're going to go to battle, and the country will have to agree to it. But we tell you them agreeing to it isn't necessarily contingent on money itself, but rather on the issues that they want to forward and have a stake in it. It's just like US entering South Ossetia. But I'm going to discuss my second issue and how expanding the war makes it bad for the US and for the other countries. So the reason why we win this first issue is because basically it is this, that when you're landing an army, you destroy the principle of your sovereign state being protected. The next part of this debate would be, is this good for the US? Yes.
Look, when you want to talk about sovereignty, we do concede that these countries have a sovereignty over their military, but when they turn it over willingly with compensation, what is your issue there?
We're telling you, if you're willing to give up with compensation, no amount of money will equal the lives of your soldiers dead. We tell you, no matter how much you're going to get, it's not justified, and we tell you the principle is false. Next part. First proposition, please sit down, no thank you. Telling us that, US is fighting so many wars, and they're heavily conscripting its own men. So they need men of the same physiological and psychological state. Now the problem is, you're limiting this debate to a last resort, meaning it's not going to happen in real life because the US has so many resources. But what happens is right now, you're making it easier for the US to enter wars. Because compare US and Singapore or any malicious military in the world. Because we tell the US is a professional army. That's why if they want to go to war, you go to war. You can send in your troops. The reason why Switzerland and Singapore don't want to go to war, because if they go to war, the citizens have a direct stake. And now what happens on their side is the argument my partner discussed on apathy, is that when you have a professional army at hand, it's easier for you to discuss, pass through diplomacy and just enter war. Because right now, if I want to go to war, it's just a snap. I'm not going to lose so much things. The problem is, what happens and how you exacerbate this issue is, right now, the men fighting your battles aren't your brothers. Meaning the people fighting your battles are people you're paying. So they're dispensable. Please sit down, no thank you. And it's becoming so easy to fight wars. And we tell you, that's a big problem. And we move on to the next idea on how this first and second proposition speakers discuss the justification of war. They're telling us the ultimate goal in every war is for the US to achieve its goals, regardless of the justice. And we tell you, the US has so many wars. And they also characterize that, so many countries are backing out. Meaning that so many countries don't believe in what the US stands for anymore. The reason why they don't want to enter the wars is because they don't agree with what the US is trying to fight for. This is no thank you. And so they're telling us, because people are pulling out, the US's goals aren't going to be met. We tell you the reason why they're pulling out is because the goals aren't good in the first place. And what happens is, by paying these people money, you're making these unfair goals which has no universal mandate to happen. And it's really unfair and very selfish on the US part. Maybe if the US government would want to be selfish, they can pass this. But for the betterment of the whole world, it's quite unfair. We don't want that. Now the problem is, the US has been criticized as a policeman of the world, and they have a knack of entering so many issues around the world. Meaning, if it's not even in the Middle East, which you don't have a direct stake in, they now enter because it's so easy for them to go to war. Please sit down, no thank you. And now they give us this idea on the expediency of war. They tell us if you have more soldiers, you can hire more people to fight your war, the war will end fast. Which is quite funny because that's assuming only the US does it. If the US legitimizes it, then their enemies can also do the same thing. Please sit down, no thank you. And what happens is you create a zero-sum game. Meaning it's a lose-lose situation that you make the war bigger and still even for both sides. You're not going to solve the problem anymore. Now at best, please sit down, no thank you. Their proposal will give no change. Unless, number one, a country is just ultimate, super uber richer than the other country, then this is what's going to happen. That's worse, it's you're going to make this war a bigger scope. And this is what we were trying to avoid. Please sit down, thank you. Ever since World War II, the UN, tried to make sure that war becomes so hard to fight, that as much as possible, war will not happen. What's happening under this side is they're trying to reduce or backward the efforts of countries around the world for decades and try to make the world more peaceful. Right now, because I can pay to go to war, it's so easy to expand the scope of war, bringing in more countries to this issue. That's something that we regret, that's something we don't want. Now, we tell you no amount of cash can compensate the loss of people. No amount of cash can compensate the expansion of war. We believe it's a big problem. The last part I want to tackle is accountability. We tell you when the U.S. got Blackwater soldiers, mercenaries, to enter the war, they were able to act under the U.S. government, but freely, meaning they have no accountability, don't answer to the U.S. government. How does this make it worse for the U.S. government? We tell you under their side, now because foreign nationals can enter the U.S., they can live under their own rules, meaning they can shoot someone. And of course, the U.S. government will have to answer this. They have to answer it because they hired this person, and then you will be accountable for the harms that happen in the battlefield. But the problem is, these soldiers belonging to a different nationality, having a different flag, means that they won't answer directly to the U.S. government. Even if they're under the, a general of the U.S., it doesn't make them answerable to it. And we tell you it's a big harm, because right now the U.S. is suffering for through so many accountability issues in the warfare. What happens is you're making it easier for this to happen, and you're making it harder for U.S. to survive the war world. For that, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
Right, thanks Speaker for your speech. We now move to replies. Invite the first reply from opposition.
The policy essentially is going to exist under two situations. First, in the current war, and second, in the future wars. And in both situations, the policy should fall and government loses. Let's take a look at the first situation, in the current war, because the only value of government is this: to make the war as quickly ended as possible. And because it's a numbers game, we're going to win because we can buy off other countries. Very simplistically argued, Mr. Speaker. Why are they going to lose? Because number one, they never really proved it. They only assumed that just because it's going to be a numbers game, it's going to be effective. Never mind, Mr. Speaker, that when the scope is shifted, it's reasonable to believe that your enemy is going to retaliate, Mr. Speaker, because alliances are blurred. We argued this from the very onset. You cannot expect your enemy to think. Now, you shouldn't attack them because they're only paid for, Mr. Speaker. But more than that, we said, Mr. Speaker, very intrinsically, the mere fact that even your enemy can buy off other nations as well means that that comparative advantage is lost, Mr. Speaker. They never said this option will only be available to the US only. We don't understand why if your enemy has the same capacities, there's a comparative advantage there. We said, Mr. Speaker, in opposition, the current war is not going to be ended, but it's going to be worsened, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because you're including other actors in the war who would not have been included had not it been for this policy, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, extending the scope of the war and the harms as a whole. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that they've proven that they're going to achieve their goals because the only thing they assumed was that it's a numbers game, but we don't think it's more simple. It's as simple as that. Second situation, Mr. Speaker, in future wars, government loses this debate by the mere fact that they dismissed it. The only thing they said was that that's not the debate because what set the debate in current wars. I think it's so naive for them not to address these situations, especially since they're arguing for a policy that's going to be constituted internationally and going to be a precedent for other wars, Mr. Speaker. By that mere fact, they lose this. But more than that, we think they lose even more in detail because they have an insufficient policy. You're talking about a constitute on war, Mr. Speaker. I can't believe they post no safeguard. Because it was only coming from, first of all, from DPM that accountability is solely going to lie on the US, Mr. Speaker. And it's only open to a lot of loopholes. Because we say, Mr. Speaker, how do you try war crimes done by the outsourced nation on its own troops, Mr. Speaker? Why is it fair that they get away with that? We don't think even on the accountability clause, they win. We say, Mr. Speaker, second reason why they lose this particular situation is because they relied all their responses on misrepresentations. Because coming from government, they said, well, we're not going to force these countries. Of course, there's consent. But we say, Mr. Speaker, coming from opposition, we never said that the harms will only exist once these nations are forced. The point is that if money becomes the clincher to war, it makes war easier, and we don't think there's a value, Mr. Speaker, in the situation of future wars. Because we think it's good that these countries are deterred from engaging in war, and even the US itself is deterred in engaging in war by its people, Mr. Speaker. Which leads me to the last reason of why they lose. Because essentially their paradigm is self-defeating. Why? Because coming from their side, most highlighted by Whip, he said that US has to be answerable to its people. But their characterization as well says that the people don't want this war to be waged. But they say that US should keep engaging it. We say, Mr. Speaker, on that premise alone, their premise or their paradigm is self-defeating. Because if you say that the US government has to be answerable sorely to its people, and if its people don't agree that the war should be waged at all, why is it that you're providing an option for the US to engage in it anyway? We don't understand their policy, and more than that, we think it's open to a lot of harms that we cannot have. We think this policy should fall. Thank you.
Right, thanks Speaker for his speech. Final speech of this debate, and I invite
We think that in this debate, where we've purposely extended and explained that wars are a necessity in some situations, the engagement from the opposition was lacking. Because first of all, apart from the blatant misrepresentation of accusing us of not having any accountability and moving on and on with it until the op-whip eventually had to agree, okay, maybe he said it. We believe that the points that they came out with do not address the core question of the debate. The core question of the debate is, when a war is in progress and you need an expedient solution in order to be able to fix it and solve it as quickly as possible, what do you do? That was the question that we asked in this debate. That was the question that they slalomed out of. Because they came out and they told us that, well, we don't really think wars should be fought. Our response was, yes, sometimes they shouldn't, but more importantly, there are times when they are fought. What do you do then? The problems we've outlined of apathy, of people being psychologically worried, of people not wanting to get into a war situation as and when we need, were not really tackled until the op-whip, who came and then told us that, well, if there's a problem, then that means your people just don't want the war to begin with. We think that that kind of analysis, apart from being late, doesn't really answer the question of whether or not people do have such a huge stake in a country's war and whether the government should be entirely reliant on the people in order to wage the war. We've told you that the accountability would lie with the US. So by extension, the US would make sure that these soldiers that they're sending out do things by the book as much as possible. We've also told you that we need to aid our ability to fight these wars and to end them as quickly as possible. Our DPM came out and explained something that they never engaged, that, you know, when you have these people in foreign countries, then it is less likely that they will be harboring the very people that you're fighting against. The response from the opposition was that no, we shouldn't have war, we should have peace, and let's all sing Kumbaya together. We think that wars are bad, obviously, but there are times when they are necessary, and the government side has gone on to explain what do you do in a case when it is necessary to fight and you do not have the necessary resource to do so. The opposition side went for a more long-term view. They said, well, we need to incentivize people to get into war. You need to force conscript them. You need to do all kinds of things to make it attractive. And then they've tried to talk about how the magnitude of war would simply be getting heightened just because there are more people. We responded by telling them that more soldiers on the ground usually can make the war a lot faster to end, and that saves lives of your very countrymen that you're trying to protect. They never really managed to give an adequate response to that issue. The main issue here is we are protecting our citizens as much as possible. If other countries are willing to assist us and we give them the necessary financial incentive to do so, why not? Their main issue in the other debate was talking about, well, now we're going to be making these countries reliant on these funds. But we do not think, and we've explained, that these countries are merely getting money from us just because, that these countries would merely be relying on a country just because of the wars that are coming out. If they want to be simplistic and accuse us of being simplistic, we think that in essence was a simplistic case that they set up with trying to accuse countries of being over-reliant on war funds. We know that wars don't happen all the time, but we are saying that when countries are willing to donate their part of the sovereignty, which we've explained, that they never really touched why sovereignty cannot be shared and why the responsibility of sovereignty cannot be shared by a government that is willing to do so, then we think that the government team has explained and discharged their burden adequately. But lastly, we also told you that the army is an extension of a state, and the only way you can go to war is to have other states help you. Currently, states are not incentivized. That was the problem we outlined. Not because they don't see the point, but simply because they don't see why they should be sending the army if it doesn't suit them in any form or fashion. We are giving them something that suits them, Mr. Speaker. We're giving them a chance to participate in the process if they so wish, knowing the threat. And because of all those reasons, we're very, very proud to propose.
Excellent. Thank you very much.